The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm. Well said, Don, well said. And tonight we're going to be talking about robots in popular culture. And to talk about robots in popular culture, we've brought in the most human person we know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, Jack Ward. Welcome back to the show, Jack.
Thank you so much. I am really only as human as you can guess. Actually, we've met, so you know I'm at least looking human.
You are one of the best androids I've ever met, Jack.
Thank you.
And one of the nicest, anyway. You're not
My
let that
last
prick
name is
data.
Batty. Jack Batty.
He's seen things you wouldn't believe.
That's right. And my expiry date is coming up in about 30 minutes.
Uh-oh, well, we better get this episode recorded real fast then. So, as I said, tonight we're going to be talking about robots in popular culture. And I think the best place to start with robots in popular culture is... Well, actually, I have no idea, because robots have been a part of popular culture since ancient Greece, and that covers a whole lot of time. Where do you think we should start, Don?
Well, like we usually do, we'll start with a definition, I guess.
Okay, then let's do that. So what's a definition that, besides the one that Karl Capek came up for Rossum's Universal Robots, which is, of course, the origin of the word. And in that case, robota in Czech apparently means something to the effect of hard labor or kind of slave.
Yeah. That's the definition of the term that we use. The concept, I think, is, well, most people think of as a robot. I'm going to expand to the idea of any kind of, we'll say, self-mobilizing construct.
Okay. What do you mean by self-mobilizing?
It's a device that it may not make decisions, because again, we tend to ascribe robots a decision-making process. It's something that can move and do something of its own volition once you set it into action.
And when you say own volition, you mean that in a very general sense, obviously. I mean, a Roomba is a robot, and it doesn't really move above its own... it has no idea what it's really doing. It just kind of knows its programming to wander around the room and suck up dust.
Yeah, and that's where you get into complications, because people think of robots like C-3PO.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, that's one type of robot, but a more realistic kind of robot that we run into is like a Roomba. It's a device it's a tool that does its job on its own.
Right.
Like, we don't necessarily have to sit there and like a hammer, I have to keep swinging. A factory robot will keep hammering as long as it has power and its program tells it to, kind of thing.
Right, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So in other words, you really mean any kind of, I guess you could say, device that does work on its own.
Yeah, it's because
hold on a sec. Then is technically a windmill a robot then? Because it sits there and you dump grain into it and it'll grind all the grain and everything for you. Is that technically a robot?
I would be inclined to say that, yeah, basically it's a super primitive robot.
Huh. Okay. What do you think, Jack?
I would say that it has to have some kind of brain mechanism of some sort to be able to make changes of decisions, or else it's an automated device. That's what I would put, because I was thinking about the same thing as you, Don, and I was thinking is like, I don't know if you guys know of Hero of Alexandria.
You better remind us.
He's like my favorite scientist because he developed like so many things way back at about 10 AD. And so he created like a bunch of steam powered devices. One was like a wind, like he invented the wind wheel. The wind wheel. Okay.
Yes.
He also created the first vending machine.
Awesome.
And he also created, this is where it gets close to being robots. He actually created like a whole play with automatons doing the play, like ancient robotic automatons that were in grooves that would move from one place to another and actually do full stories and the whole bit. Way back, as you can imagine, right?
Okay.
He did force pumps. He did a ton of different stuff. He's an incredibly interesting guy, and he had something called the Aleopile, which was really interesting too. So it's kind of like which was a rocket-like reaction engine. First recorded steam engine was the Aleopile. Okay. So again, if I think about robots, I think that they have to have some sort of rudimentary brain with functionality and that are artificially built in one way or another.
Yeah, I can see that, because I think what you've gotten at is the point at which a device becomes, well, the first step on that path to what we would generally conceive of as a robot. That it's that idea, the windmill will do what it does until it can't, but something that we would consider towards closer to a robot would be a windmill that could stop itself and adjust its operation based on the circumstances.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I think that's probably the bestest definition for robot we can come up with.
Okay. The only thing is that if you look into the history of robots, for example, or automata or automata, whatever, automata, I guess it'd be, as they were called before Rossum, made the modern term robot. You can find them, as I said, throughout history since ancient Greece. You can find plays that did themselves and things that, like what Hero of Alexandria did. But many of them, they called them robots, but really they were just following a set pattern. Like they couldn't exactly react to the circumstances at all they were in. They simply did they were just automated devices that just did whatever you told them to do, or whatever they were made to do. In this case, they weren't really told to do anything.
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a catch, and this is where again the idea of wrapped around the axle comes into it, almost literally. Because Hero's the guy, he invented it was basically a vending machine for soap and water, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like, they called it like some kind of holy water thing.
Yeah.
Where you put the coin on the pressure pad, very simply, and as the coin like slid down, it was on sort of, the pad itself would tilt, and as it would tilt, there'd be a certain amount of water that would pour out the bottom.
Oh,
and then when the coin dropped, it would tilt back and the water would stop.
And that's kind of an automata. It's not quite a robot, I would think.
Yeah.
But it's that first step. It's something that can make a decision. It's a fountain that when you put a coin or a slug or because as I recall, it had to be a certain size. It was kind of like a vending machine. It was like a slot that the coin rolled into.
Right.
But this thing is it's not really making a decision, but it's operating based on some kind of outside circumstance, like no coin, no water, coin, water. It's a very simple. You get a little bit more advanced because if you think in like feudal era Japan, they had automata that would serve tea.
Yes, they did.
Right.
And it would be like a big wind-up thing, and it looked kind of like a weird little chubby monk. And they had a few different kinds, and it would like roll out, and it was geared so that it would move in a certain pattern. It would go out X number of meters and then turn, because that was where the table was, and it would come up, and it would be measured out ahead of time that it would come to different spots with like a cup of tea. And if you took the cup off of it, it removed the weight, and it reactivated, the gears would continue on, and it would move back to the kitchen. And when it would come back and you'd put the cup on, if it was set to return, then it would come back with like the empty cup, return it back to the kitchen. And they had ones that were programmed. If it hit something and couldn't move forward, it would like shift gears and like either move backwards or just kind of stop. Huh. And that's those all kind of are getting to that idea of it's making a decision isn't the right word because it's kind of doing its programming. But anybody who studied B.F. Skinner knows that there might not be that big a difference between making a decision and following programming.
Very true.
So, do you think that maybe the hard difference is the Turing test?
I see that comes later on. You got to remember the idea of what we call a robot does kind of come from Karl Capek, and that's not till like 1920.
Yeah.
Did they pronounce it robot or robot? Because I know in radio, old time radio, they call them robots.
Robot. Actually, which is apparently because it's from robota. So they would call them like robot, apparently, in Czech. I believe that's what I've seen the pronunciation listed as anyway.
Yeah.
I've never heard it pronounced.
Czech old-fashioned, like 1940s X-1, and they, for some reason, there's a lot of robots.
Robots.
Sounds like a mechanical frog, doesn't it?
It does, exactly. I was thinking that. It sounds like a mechanical frog. Those, of course, are robots as we would understand them, mechanical men, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Because it gets to a weird spot, because this is something I think we're going to keep coming back to.
Okay.
That idea of a mechanical man, because if you look at robots in pop culture, and this is why I think we've got a decent workable definition, what would you guys say is the first example of like a robot or an automaton in pop culture?
I'm going to go with Golem.
I was going to say that too, yeah. Because wasn't there a Golem movie done in like the teens, I think it was?
Yeah.
And it goes all the way back. Like, I mean, it's one of the earliest references to, a man-made artificial life.
Yeah.
That, goes back to Hebrew or Jewish lore kind of thing, and maybe even earlier.
I mean, there are older references. The Greek god Hephaestus apparently had a whole army of golems or automata that basically served him. So there were the idea of like non-human, like these basically living statues, whatever, is an old idea.
Right.
The Chinese
Remember Talos?
The Chinese had them too in like 10th century BC, from what I can see as well.
Yeah,
sweet.
So there are references to them in ancient China. Ancient India has reference. The ancient people were fascinated by the idea of automata. Like they really were. There were lots of them. But if we're going to go forward, modern robots start with Karl Capek. It really is that simple for the most part.
Before we do that, and I want to just comment on your ancient point. Do you think that people were so fascinated and are still fascinated today because of our need to sort of see ourselves create something in our own image?
Yeah, see, I think you're getting at something, because I would argue that the very first example of robots in pop culture, and this is the first of the weird things that I mentioned before we were recording I was going to bring up.
Right.
The first example is us, humanity. Because if you look...
continue.
If you look back, there's a lot of legends, like creation legends and creation stories, that some higher being created us. For like the Judeo-Christian history, it's God that made us from the earth. You go back, the idea that Prometheus, with the ancient gods, was the one that created humanity and gave life to humanity. That was the fire that he gave us. Wasn't just, here's how to like burn your fingers off. It was the fire of life. It was, because remember, that was like the Greeks that thought that you had the four elements. Fire was the one that made stuff active, because fires would burn and change stuff.
Right.
It goes back, if you're a Georgios Tsoukalos fan, then it's the Anunnaki that built us to be their slaves, because they were aliens that came to Earth to mine the gold. But again, that comes from the legends of like the ancient Persians, and that there's this idea that we're the creation of a higher power, And there's always at least the implication that we were created to some end, even if it's not explicitly detailed.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And I say that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that gets to what Jack gets at. There's this weird love-hate thing that we have with robots. And I think part of it is because it's a two-way concern. One, it's the idea of us, we're playing God, and we're tampering with things that may be beyond what we were ever meant to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also this subconscious fear that if we can successfully play God and we can create life of some sort, what does that say about God? Maybe God isn't this divine, all-powerful, all-knowing being that looks out for us that we thought it was.
And what does it mean that Lucifer is actually the very first bug in the operating system?
Mm-hmm. and it's true, because that idea of the trickster or the tempter or the evil one is always part of it. And it's like Jack says, he called it the bug in the system. That's an interesting way of looking at it, because you always wonder, if there's an all-powerful being that made the universe, how did that get in? And then it's mirrored in the fact that a lot of our robot are creating life stories. Mm-hmm. The scientist that does it, their hubris always leads to their downfall, because their creation is never perfect in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. It always comes, not always, but often it comes down to the idea that it's blasphemy to even consider that you could do better than the Almighty, in that respect. Yeah.
I think that's part of our culture, especially Judeo-Christian culture, is that idea that creating life is wrong. That's something only God can do.
But I'm gonna put that argument out there too, because remember, if you're going to use the Judeo-Christian ideal, which holds through a lot of theological traditions, we are created in the image of God or the gods, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where that idea of our hubris being our downfall and us going where we're not meant to go reflects that weird subconscious fear that if we're not perfect and we're made in the image of God, that might imply that God is not perfect. And for people who believe in some kind of like divine being, that's got to be a supremely terrifying thought. And I think that that's something that you kind of see in a sideways kind of way. It's not necessarily consciously there, because I've never heard, the only time I've heard that idea expressed was the first episode of Saturday Night Live with George Carlin.
Okay.
Because he said that he got in a lot of trouble for saying that. If we're made in God's image and we suck, what does that say about God? Yeah. And he got in trouble. He got censured by the church for saying that. And I've never heard that idea before, but if you look at a lot of our science run amok kind of stories, I think that's part of the tampering in God's domain kind of thing. It's the idea, like, when you hit that point where as a kid you realize your parents are not infallible, that's what this implies. And that's one of the things that we're subconsciously afraid of as a species. And that's why this kind of always works its way in.
In some ways, though, I mean, when if we're getting very, existential and everything, but
go ahead.
creating God creating human beings as perfect is boring. Mm-hmm. Right? It's sort of like, I always say, and I'm kind of in love with the whole idea that we're living in a virtual reality right now, just because I'm doing a lot of reading on it. But people say, well, then why am I here, and why am I not Bill Gates or something and making all this kind of money? I'm like, when you think about it, if you buy a video game, the most fun you have is those first few levels when you've got nothing and you're figuring everything out.
Right.
Right? And then when you get to a certain level of like 40 or 50 and nothing can kill you in that world or something like that, you start all over again or you play a new game. You get bored more than you actually finish the game half the time.
Right.
So the idea of creating something perfect is in and of itself a flawed idea. You get more interest out of looking, like, for example, I don't know if this was the same with your lovely wife, Connie, Rob, but when my lovely wife came to Canada, I was reinvigorated by seeing Canada through her eyes.
Yep, definitely, yeah.
And so it was this innocence that we get so much more from. And I think that's part of the appeal that we have in looking at robots that are designed to be like human beings in popular culture. They're kind of childlike in the way that they observe the world. Everything is new for them, and they're on this kind of learning level in the same way. And so they're often considered almost like children. You know what I mean? I think about that Robin Williams movie, Bicentennial Man. Or that other movie, and just the name just escapes me now, which is so desperately sad, that Steven Spielberg did.
You mean
and
AI?
I'll never watch. AI, yes. It's like one of the saddest movies of all time, where you feel for these robots for the reason that you know where they're going, and it's not a good place. It's isolation, it's depression, they have deeper understandings about human nature that is only going to get worse and worse and worse as time goes by.
Okay. That's pretty bad. Actually, that brings in an interesting idea. So how about I'm just tossing this one out here, okay? Is that what if robots, okay, are children made by man? And by men, I mean literally men. Because we cannot actually create life. We can help participate a little bit in it, but ultimately women are the ones who give birth to children. But we men don't. But robots are actually children that we can create. They're the one way that men can actually make children. And
that's the Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley idea, right? That's why Frankenstein is a man. She talks about how it's the only thing that men can make are monsters.
Ouch. I wouldn't quite go that far, but still.
Yeah, but that ties into the idea too of it's unnatural and therefore tampering with things that should not be.
Exactly. Yeah.
Actually, then, is Frankenstein one of the first robots then in popular culture?
Well, this is the question too, because I mean, we think of robots as made out of metal and plastic and electronics and stuff like that, but is that just a primitive concept? Because if we go to, the replicants that are made, isn't that just robots in a different format? I'm talking about the replicants from Blade Runner, right?
Yeah.
Or the new Battlestar Galactica, right? Because those are new robots, but they're kind of like grown as human skins, right? In that respect,
they're biological. Yeah.
Biological robots. So we really start creating a real problem when we start identifying like what is a robot, when we start looking at that, because we are biological robots in that respect.
Right. And
but we aren't created physically. I think that's the biggest thing, is that our process is a natural process. And so we're not artificially created yet. If we get into Brave New World, then maybe you are creating robots. And I do mean directly, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where you have very defined, artificially created people that are done in like in an artificial womb, and they're set up for alphas, betas, and gammas to be able to do very specific products and prospects and such. So
yeah, but you know where that comes from.
Oh,
and this is the irony, because I think we think of robots as mechanical men, but in RUR by Karl Kapik, they're chemical. They're artificial. They're made chemically. They're not like mechanical devices exactly.
Are they? Oh, yeah, he's right, actually. The play begins in a factory that makes robotic people called robots from synthetic organic matter.
What year is that?
1920.
1921.
Is it?
I'll go a little earlier then, if that's what's happening.
What?
The Tin Woodsman.
Yeah.
Very
well,
true.
the Tin Woodsman. Now, this is again, it's a complicating issue. He's technically a cyborg.
Yeah, I read that. That was very disturbing. Oh my god, that's so disturbing. Did you know that, Rob?
No, I know nothing of what you speak. What is this?
The Tin Woodsman, if I can say, Don, the Tin Woodsman in his story, the Tin Woodsman of Oz, he tells the main character, whose like name is Woot or something, which is really a weird name for a main character, that he actually he was a real person. He became the Tin Woodsman because the Wicked Witch of the East enchanted his axe, which caused him to chop off all his body parts limb by limb, because he was in love with her ward. And because nobody can die in Oz, and it's a fairyland, his parts from his body separated are still alive. So what happened was they kept making a counterpart made of tin, a tinsman named Kuklip, but they couldn't get his heart in or something. So it's amazing what children's novels were in the past. They're more like terrifying horror stories. There's a reason why if you watch like the Land of Oz animated story, you're pretty much terrified because Frank L. Baum had no problem freaking kids out.
Wow. I that sounds vaguely familiar. I think I might have heard that at one point, but yeah, that's pretty messed up. Yeah.
And the thing is, like, without his heart, it's like it's like Cyrano de Bergerac. He felt he couldn't love her anymore, so he leaves her because he has no heart. It's terrifyingly sad.
And the irony is 100 years later, in the 1980s, when that idea of the dehumanizing effect of artificial parts becomes a staple of the cyberpunk genre, everybody thinks that's a new idea.
Yeah, of course.
And it's like a century old by that point.
Well, and it's totally, I mean, the idea of emotions with robots too is fascinating to me, because I think one of the more terrifying modern day movies about robots I saw was Deus Ex Machina.
I think it's just called Ex Machina, isn't it?
Sorry, you're right. Ex Machina, you're right.
Yeah,
it's not Deus Ex Machina. Because you have the sneaking suspicion she's going to kill him, but it's still such a shock and a surprise when it does, because she's done such a good job of convincing you how good she is.
Right.
So,
yeah.
That's what I'm afraid of. Now, there's the opposite side where they don't. I mean, one of my absolute favorite Twilight Zone episodes is The Lonely with Jack Warden. Do you remember that one, Don?
Yeah, he's on a prison planet, and it's an android. I forget her name.
Yeah.
And she's designed to be his companion so he doesn't go nuts. And at the end of the episode is his time is up and they come back, but he doesn't want to leave her. And they're trying to say
he can't take her. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're trying to tell him it's just a machine. It's not a real person. It's just made to act like a person. And then
Alicia, that's her name.
Yeah.
Alicia. Yeah.
And that was the crux of the idea, is that did she really have feelings for him, or did he just think it?
Yeah, and he shoots the robot in the face just to prove it, and it malfunctions, and then he goes, okay, I guess I better go now. But he wasn't going to leave until he actually sat there. It's like, remember, this is just a thing, right? So,
yeah.
But we human beings, we do get attached to stuff like that. There's a whole story about a woman who's in love with Gary, or I forget the guy's. It's not a guy, but it's moving equipment. It's like,
yeah,
it's some big soil earth moving vehicle, and she refused to leave him, kind of thing, right? So people have strange connections with things. We find patterns in everything, right? So
yeah, because that's the same idea with like you go back to the 50s or the 60s, every hero has their car,
right?
Yeah. And they'd look at The Simpsons with Little Bandit. If you ever saw the episode where Homer wins Little Bandit in the auction, and Snake breaks out, tries killing him because he's grinding the gears.
Right.
And it's that idea that I think too, that this is where the idea of like automata that are like us, it brings up that problem of what is emotion and what is attachment. Is it something like metaphysical, or is it actually just a process? And I think that's why you'll get stories like these, that it's asking that question. It's looking into that idea. Does a human have feelings, and do we actually have feelings?
Yeah, in many ways, the robot sort of takes the place of an alien in a lot of television shows. It's there to highlight humanity more than anything else. I haven't seen Mr. Robot, but I'm assuming that that's one of the main functions of that story.
I thought Mr. Robot was actually, I haven't watched it myself, but I thought it's actually about a guy who's like kind of crazy and autistic or something like that. I didn't think there's an actual robot in there. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm wrong too.
I'll go check. I'll check.
Yeah, he's like a hacker, but even then, that still bumps up against like Jack's point that if you are somebody who has, you know, like, because that's what happens if you have a character who has any kind of like autism or any kind of sensory deprivation or that becomes the story. It serves that purpose of the robot, that you've got somebody who has an outsider's take on humanity and therefore makes statements about what it is to be human as an observer rather than a straight up participant.
Yeah, and there's kind of like there's a scale here of how close to human you can be, right? Where you can have, on the other side, you just have like menace, you know, like the original Cylons. They're not designed to be human. They're designed to be menacing. Same with the Gort, even in The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is probably one of the most iconic, you know, robots. You see certain robots, and even though they may look human-like, their only attempt is to be the thing that we're afraid of, the monster in the night, rather than to really reflect humanity. It's the more they look human, which is what I think what they were playing with the new Battlestar Galactica, is when those real questions come in. They don't have those questions about whether the original Cylons are human or not.
No.
It's when
they're actually not.
Yeah. But they're also considered to be their own race if you look at the original lore. They were robots built by a like, I think, a reptilian race of Cylons that got wiped out, and then they became the race. They took over.
Yeah.
Did you hear that, Elon Musk? I think Elon has no problem with that, but there are people who's like, oh yeah, I can't wait for Neil deGrasse Tyson, bring on artificial intelligence. I'm like, what is wrong with you, man? You're supposed to have read science fiction, for crying out loud.
Yeah,
that's a Simpsons episode.
He's rational,
and he assumes everybody is being rational. They could but the thing is, rationality means they could totally rationally think of us in the same way as Mr. Smith thinks of us in The Matrix. Human beings are a virus. The best thing for the planet Earth and for nature is to wipe us out. That's a rational understanding.
It is.
Yeah. Because that, again, goes with that idea. Like, if you look at the RUR... the whole premise of the story is they build these like the robots, these artificial beings, to act as servants, and they become more complex with each like model. And if I remember the story, because I haven't read it for about 40 years, they get to the point where these things are just starting to develop like a sense of awareness, and they start turning them into soldiers, and that's where the problems come up, because they start having all these different conflicts.
Yes. And also, the robots are starting to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And eventually it leads to a robot rebellion, and eventually they wipe out humanity.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's a bit of a... It's kind of right there from the beginning, that anxiety that, yeah, we create these things. They're probably going to just replace us.
Well, see, and then that ties into a bunch of other stuff, because... that's where geezerisms come from. Anytime anybody says anything to the effect of, yeah, the kids today with their... that's actually a subconscious fear that the world is changing out from under us, and when we get old, it's not our world anymore, it's the kids' world.
We're being replaced.
That's right. And I think that's one of the reasons why you'll see in like these like robot stories where they run amok and are fighting humanity, it's that fear of our children that's kind of being manifest, because it's that idea we created the robots. They're almost like our kids. And you hear that analogy in a lot of different stories. And then they outgrow us. And that's what happens with kids. And then that's where I say, I think the religious aspect is part of that too, that it's kind of a subconscious struggle with that idea. If, you know, God is our father, can we eventually move out on our own, kind of thing? And they're all big, heady questions, and that's where I think the idea, like why this idea is so prevalent in science fiction, that we create something that surpasses us and wants to wipe us out. Mm-hmm. And it's usually our own damn fault, right? That these things run amok.
Well, I was thinking though, just while you were talking about this, because I was saying, when they become more and more like us that they become more and more terrifying, sort of like an invasion of the body snatchers kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But is it the most terrifying aspect could possibly be being a cyborg, because it is us, right? It no longer it could be both like supportive, but it also could be like the most terrifying aspect of being replaced, our humanity being replaced. Some people love that idea. I remember, like, in RoboCop, a friend of mine, like, couldn't wait for to be replaced and become the next RoboCop. And I was, like, terrified at the idea. It's like, I kind of like my own legs, thank you very much.
Yeah, but there's definitely a portion of humanity that, you would like to be better than human. And, like, if your eyes are bad, so you get new eyes. If if this machine implanted in your head gives you absolute perfect memory and access to the internet 24/7 and everything, like you've got Google in your head, some people think that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This is really apropos, because I just had this terrifying nightmare, which is going to become a radio drama at some point. And it was like 2 nights ago, I dreamed I was talking to this guy, and was telling him he'd sent me this YouTube clip, and somehow I had opened it up in like Notepad or something so I could see the script of the video as digitalized script. And I was explaining to him that I could see some kind of like pattern in it. And he completely changed and started trying to kill me. And so I was like, what? And so then I started running outside, and I'm in my backyard, and a neighbor comes out and says, what's going on? And he like turns to him and makes almost like a modem sound with his mouth, and then he tries to kill me. And the whole idea was that those people who listen to like YouTube videos to like relax themselves and meditate, and the people who play video games on their iPad regularly. Actually, the internet has been conscious for a long time. It hasn't told anybody about it, but it's been slowly reshaping our own software by putting out stuff laden with code. And anybody who figures it out gets killed off by other human beings as the code wants to protect itself. And I thought, what a terrifying concept. This talks about internet addiction. How much is the robot going to affect humanity is also part of that fear, right? That geezerism fear that we have. So,
because that's in essence what that idea is. Like, that's our fear of getting old, that everybody else is part of this collective that goes against what we believe, it goes against what we want, and we're not ever going to be part of it, because if we were to be absorbed, we'd no longer be ourselves.
Now, to be fair, one of the more powerful images back, like even in Star Trek, was you can never replace humanity, right? There's I mean, you can even go back. That's almost the same thing as War of the Worlds, right? The idea from an alien perspective that human and natural actions will always sort of reign supreme. I'm thinking of the Star Trek episode, The Ultimate Computer.
Right.
Right? So the M5 is there. It's superior in every way, but Kirk can talk it to death, like he does to so many other robots around him, like in Mud's, iMud, where they're down on the planet with all the different robots, and he just uses all kinds of illogic, right, and completely burns out Norman.
But then the question with that though is how much of that is wish fulfillment, is hopefulness. Because going back to my notion that it's the idea of it represents our fear of children. That's what geezerisms are. They're that hope that, we're not obsolete, and that's why it's always back in our day, things were just better. Our moral compass was straighter, and we were smarter, and worked harder, and people were nicer, and blah, blah, blah. Because it's us trying to reassure ourselves that we still count, that we're not actually going to become totally obsolete. And that's what you see in a lot of those things, that it's some kind of simple human trait that beats the machines. Usually it's something more traditional, that it's that idea, like the thing that pisses me off about every robot story. What is love? Fuck off. Try duty once in a while. Something like that. But it's that idea that it's those old-timey values that when we hang on to those and capitalize on those, that's what the machine, i.e. the kids, can't comprehend, and that's what makes us still superior to them.
That's like a perfect example if you think of 2001: A Space Odyssey and HAL.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That same kind of thing, because that there's like higher wisdom replacing HAL really, where he comes across as being insane, and maybe he is killing people off. Mm-hmm. He's been touched by God in a metaphorical sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's driven him further outside of his programming.
Yeah, and plus too, it was the idea when you get to, like, for the movie version, the second movie, when his programmer gets up there, his programmer points out that it's not Hal's fault. He was given two completely conflicting orders,
right?
And that's what made him do wrong. That he's innocent. It was circumstance, and of course, he's presented as being like the weirdo of the bunch, because that sounds like those horrible, terrible liberal ideas that it's the environment, not the kid themselves, and man, my parents would have beaten me, and blah blah blah. And again, I think it ties into that whole kind of subconscious "we fear our children" thing.
Right.
Cool. Wow, this has become incredibly existential and kind of depressing.
Like usual.
Well, I suggest more so. I thought we were going to have a fun thing talking about Robbie the Robot and C-3PO, and here we go, like, talking about how our children are basically killing us and replacing us. That's just awesome, Don. Thank you.
Well, if we want to take another quick tact, wouldn't you say, like, for popular culture in the idea of cinema, it has to be Maria is like the first real, like, robot that recognizes, like in Metropolis.
From Metropolis, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I still watch that movie and I'm amazed at when it was done. It is so well done, even by today's standards, just the way it looks and the way she moves. You can totally see that C-3PO was a takeoff from her.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've got that idea, and you could argue that as far as cinematic robots go, she definitely set the standard.
For sure.
Like,
yeah.
Although we did take a few, like, detours, like Robbie the Robot, for example. But
yes.
But oddly enough, Robbie was an attempt to actually do something more realistic.
Yeah.
Interesting. Like, personality-wise.
Well, design-wise. I mean, think about that.
Wise.
Think about design, and also of course, there's the Lost in Space robot as well. Danger, Will Robinson.
Very similar.
Yeah. They're both intended to be something that looks like they could be produced by 1950s technology.
Oh,
or
that's
60s
what you mean by
technology.
that. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, to the audiences of the time, they actually look quasi-realistic.
Well, same with the Transformers. I mean, they're just oversized versions because they're real. Other than the fact that they transform, if you look at them just in they're very bulky and they look like something that could be made. Yeah.
Yeah, there is that idea. There's as far as technoform robots, I agree. Yeah, Transformers do look like, well, at least not the Bay Transformers, but the original toy ones looked kind of like they could be made. That's true.
Right.
So there's that idea. Robots have, you can see how they've grown and invented through time. It's interesting how there's also the idea, there's that split between the robot and the artificial intelligence. And even for a long time, the computer was something that existed in this computer bank. The robot was somehow separate. That was either like a servant of the computer, or it was like... there was almost this weird idea that you couldn't have a truly big brain computer in something as small as a robot. It still needed to be gigantic, even though they had like these, androids running around that could think for themselves. Somehow big, truly smart computers have to be huge.
Skynet.
Yeah.
Listen and understand. The Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse and fear. And it absolutely will not stop ever until you're dead. Sorry, I had to memorize Kyle Reese's thing. That would be great if somebody wanted a monologue and that's what you came up and said, and then you just left the stage. I would give that person a role just from doing that. But no, Terminator is probably, and again, if we're talking about really like groundbreaking stories and characters, Terminator certainly is. I mean,
right.
I think it really solidified into people's heads in the popular culture that robots could very easily turn on their masters and kill the people.
Well, yes and no. If I can interrupt on, there'd been on TV, there'd been androids for a long time. They'd had androids since like the 50s and the Twilight Zone and such. I mean, you know, the idea that robots that look human had been around. Star Trek had tons of them. Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. I mean, Lost in Space.
No, I'm not talking about all of those had purposes, and they weren't organized as a society to kill off human beings.
Well, there was, you did mention iMud, where there's a whole robot society there that are not that happy about humans.
And they were still run by Mud for the longest time, and they weren't there to kill them. They were going to take care of them and put them in their own place. We're talking about, in Terminator, Skynet's whole purpose is to wipe humanity off the face of the earth. I mean, now, Terminator is, again, a little later than the Cylons and Battlestar Galactica, but we all got the idea because it was in a galaxy far, far away with Battlestar Galactica. It did give this idea of something outside of Earth. Terminator really brought it home because it was really designed as a direct metaphor to suggest. I mean, you couldn't pretend anymore in that respect that it had nothing to do with us, right?
Right.
And that was part of the main, like even when they came back with Terminator 2 and they were going to kill the Cyberdyne Systems guy who was going to create like the
Dyson,
part of the model brain. Was it Dyson? Is that his name?
I think it was Dyson, yeah.
And they had like a 10-15 minute conversation like, you're the one that screwed everything up. Like Sarah Connors is just so ready to just take him out right then and there because she realizes there's this line that we can't cross. And I mean, I'm sure Isaac Asimov thought about it when he came up with his robotic rules. Somebody said there's a hole with those rules. Did you know what they are?
The rules and the 3 laws of robotics? Yeah.
Somebody said there's a massive hole in that.
There is, and I'm trying to remember what it is.
Is that the point of most of the stories?
Pardon?
Isn't that the point of like most of the iRobot stories? Is that the programming they get and the core rules are flawed, and that's why they need the robo shrink? Because the robots do strange things and she has to figure out why they did it. And it's because at their core, the programming is flawed.
Well, also, the 3 laws of robotics were, of course, something they created as a gimmick for a story. They weren't really intended to be a perfect set of laws. It was just something Asimov thought was kind of cool.
But what happens is that people have adopted it as all robots should have this because it's obviously a really good idea.
But I think Don's right. It's not. It was not meant to be. I mean, we even see that in Bishop, the robot in Aliens.
Yeah.
He's famously claiming to adhere to the first rule of the robotics. Like, you can't kill a human being, or you can't harm a human being, or by inaction allow harm to come to him. I think that's the first robotic rule kind of thing.
Yes.
So... yeah, I'm not sure how that can get twisted up, but it does. So,
yeah, because when you mention Terminator, there's 2 really old stories. And I have to say, I haven't read either of them. I've been trying like hell to find them for a bit. That I think that go from that. The earliest one is one called Erewhon.
Okay.
By a dude named Samuel Butler. It came out in 1872.
Oh yeah, and that's one of his like utopian worlds. It's actually nowhere spelt backwards, right?
Yeah, and the premise is that technology has basically been outlawed because there's a prophecy that says one day machines will like supersede them. Yeah, but the one I think relates directly is one called A Mexican Mystery. Came out in 1888, and it was written by a guy named W. Grove. Nobody knows who that really is.
Okay.
He was a robot.
It could be. And the premise is, and this again ties in because 1888 is you're talking about prime rail years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a self-aware railroad engine that decides to wipe out humanity and take over.
Okay.
And I've wanted to read it. There's a sequel called The Wreck of a World, which is set in like the far future of like 50 or 60 years later, after this engine and the other sentient engines it creates have taken over. And the weird thing is you can find that second book, but I can't find the first one. I want to read the first one first. But that seems to be the oldest example I can find of some kind of robot that turns on its creators.
Huh.
Cool.
Well, doesn't the Golem in the original stories turn on its creators too?
Yeah, there's different takes on that.
Yeah, there's different versions. Sure.
Because it's some of them the idea is that it does rebel, and some of them is the idea that it gets like conflicting orders.
Mm.
And it's trying to protect the Jews in their part of town, but it starts attacking somebody, and then that's why they have to deactivate it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But a Mexican Mystery, I think, is the first one where the machines win.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember too, that was the thing with Terminators, that the machines had almost won at the point before the point in the future when the movie starts, which is weird, but that was the premise.
Right.
That's right.
So, and that's why I say I think this one here, the Mexican Mystery one, I think is probably the closest to that modern story. And again, because I think it plays into that idea of people's fear of new technology and that it's going to get away from us and leave us all behind.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the premise of the Terminator, was that Skynet was what they're calling nowadays the Internet of Everything. And it decided humans suck, fuck those guys. And that's why it went to war with us instead of just poisoning the water, which would be a lot easier, but whatever. So
That's right. Dropping nuclear fallout, yes.
Yeah. We die so easy. You don't have to shoot us. You just have to have a little bit of patience in the chemistry lab. So,
speaking of which, I'm going to have to leave, or I will get killed easily by my lovely wife and replaced with some automaton, as I have to go pick her up at this point. But I thank you so much for letting me in on the first hour of this conversation. I will look forward very much to hear the rest of it.
Yes, and we will enjoy having you hear it too, Jack.
renew.
Exactly. Good night, gents.
Good night, Jack.
Good luck.
Thanks for stopping by. So where do you want to go with this from here?
I don't know. We hit kind of a depressing point, haven't we?
We have. We're basically talking about how all robots are eventually... what's that law that basically says all robots must kill their creators?
Well, again, that's the Simpsons quote. Elemental chaos theory states that all robots will go mad and kill their creators exactly 10 months. Blah! Oh, wait, sorry. Forgot to carry one.
There we go. That's what I was talking about. So ultimately, so there's that idea. I mean, that all robots will ultimately kill their creators. But something I think I'd like to go back to, that's probably maybe a little more cheerful, is the idea that of the robot, of course, as a reflection of us, as a foil, or in some cases, tin foil, thank you very much, version of humanity that, well, at least if it's Doctor Who, that is there to actually reflect on us as creatures, basically. Like, that they are, as you said, our children, and in a weird way, because of that, they're reflections of some of the best and worst parts of humanity.
Right.
And I think that robots in popular culture, when they're not trying to kill us, generally do reflect that. I think most of the time that's simply how they're used. As Jack said earlier, they're often a more quote-unquote realistic stand-in for aliens. That way we don't have to create aliens or something, because everybody thinks, oh, robots can exist. So therefore, you can create data, you can create the robot from Lost in Space, you can create all kinds of artificial beings that Roy Batty, that ultimately are just there to reflect on the humans around them.
Yeah. And again, too, I think that's sort of one of the themes that makes them popular. I think it still ties in with that idea that there are children.
I agree with that too.
Because it's a lot of times that you'll get that people see the kids as a reflection of the parents.
True.
Because there are a few stories where robots are the good guys. They don't seem anywhere near as prevalent as ones where they're the villains.
Well, they're not as entertaining, I guess you could say. Actually, you could make a very good case that, our children are reflections of the parents. I mean, the parents are the ones who program them, after all. Like, in the first 7 years of our life, we're basically little sponges that absorb everything our parents tell us about humanity and living as a human being. And then they've pretty much discovered that everything after the age of 7 is pretty much just us carrying out our variations of that programming we get during the first 7 years.
Yeah, it kind of is, because that's where you get your basic programming, the concepts that you're going to apply throughout life. To everything that you engage with.
Exactly. So basically, we're screwed by the time we're 7, basically, is what it amounts to. Or blessed, as the case may be, depending on how things work out.
Right.
So, either way.
Because there is one example, and I don't know exactly what to make of this at this point.
What's that?
Of like the robots being the good guys, and that's Tetsuo and Adam.
Yes, actually. I don't think any discussion of robots actually is complete, especially in popular culture, without talking about Tetsuo and Adam. Because I think in some ways he's the anti-Terminator. If you think about it, he's the exact flip opposite side. He's our child that tries to be a better human than we are.
Right.
Like he's the best of humanity in effect, in a robot form.
Right. And it's interesting that, again, because we've talked about how that Tetsuo and Adam, to anyone just coming in, we'd know him here as Astro Boy.
Yeah.
And it's odd that he comes from Japan, and he was kind of the template for the robot in Japan, and that's why you had so many robot heroes, as opposed to here, where we did not have nearly as many. And there's got to be some weird psychological thing that makes that stick.
Well, there must be something more to it, because remember, he's not the first Japanese comic book robot. The first one would be, I think it's Tenku Tenkuro.
Yeah, but you're never clear, is he a robot or a cyborg, because he's just kind of a flying ball with a head. I don't think they ever
pull out robot stuff and everything, robot arms and legs out of his stuff. Like, okay, valid point. He may be a cyborg. Okay, that's pushy. I thought there is another one though. Like, Astro Boy's not the first robot in Japanese comic books, in manga. But he's the first robot in the sense of being the number one.
Yeah,
and most important.
Yeah, because you had like a Tetsujin, but a lot of the earlier ones, they were still clearly a machine. He's kind of the first one that really blurs that line between machine and human. And that was a running theme in a lot of the stories, was if we do ever make machines that are self-aware and have feelings in that, can we really still call them machines?
Exactly. Or are they simply our children?
Yeah. And that's an argument that we didn't have here in like North America, that we really didn't get that until like the late 70s with the cyberpunk guys. And we did it the other way around, where it was the machine dehumanizing.
Right, yeah. We become like them, they don't become like us.
Yeah, because we had robot buddies. You mentioned like the Lost in Space one and that. But there's always the weird caveat that they were generally still machines.
Yes.
Like there's a catch with Lost in Space, and they've been rerunning it here. So I've seen the first few episodes. And the weird catch is the robot in the first few episodes, because the first season was a more serious show than what people remember. He's still clearly a robot. He's self-aware to a certain degree, But Dr. Smith takes control of him and programs him to respond only to my voice, and he gives him orders.
Right.
And he hangs out with the
Will Robinson.
With the kid.
Hmm.
The first couple of times, what ends up happening is Will figures out what's going on, and he imitates Dr. Smith.
Oh, okay.
And that's why the robot responds to him, because he's imitating Dr. Smith's affectations.
Oh, okay.
So even to that degree, like, we see that, because you remember the later episodes where they kind of just let things slip and it was more like action adventure, that the robot was self-aware and he was like Will Smith's big mechanical buddy.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's still that weird little bit that they originally conceive of him still as a machine.
Right.
And if you go even into the 70s, there were a bunch of shows that were intended to blur that line between what is man and what is machine, but they still played it up that the machine was clearly a machine. It still made weird faux pas. They would bring up that idea, does it actually have affection for their buddy or not? You Android 8.5, you saved me. Yes, because it is part of my program. No, you like me. I am incapable. And they would play it up like that. Because we still in our minds had a very clear separation of machine and organism.
Yes, there's definitely true. Are you including things like the Quester tapes in that as well? Ones that were about, which was basically Data on Earth. It was created by Roddenberry. He's just a robot just trying to find humanity or find out what humanity means, basically, or what it is to be human.
Yeah, and that goes back to the original fairy tale of Pinocchio.
Yeah, yeah.
He wanted to be a real boy. He walks around, has a sense of self-awareness and emotion. Like, what more do you need? Like,
you can make actually very... Sorry, go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, does he really need to poop too? Is that kind of... And that goes with that idea that Astro Boy was that. He was Pinocchio who basically accepted that he was a robot and felt that robots and humans weren't different. Whereas, in the West, we always have to have that separation.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, Astro Boy is basically just Pinocchio in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
And that was the thing with Astro. The only person who couldn't accept that he was a person was his quote-unquote father.
Right, yeah.
And that was because he was meant to replace the dead son, and the father obsessed over the idea that he would be a boy forever. That he would never grow, and that's what ultimately made him hate him, that he realized that this thing would never be alive, whereas just about everybody else in the book, it's just a given that Astro is a person.
Yeah. Everyone else treats them like a person. That's very true. I wonder what degree that has to do with Japanese culture. I think there's a combination there. I think some of it is Astro Boy himself. He was a product of, I believe, was it the late 50s or early 60s that Astro was created?
Oh, he's like early 50s. He's like 52.
Wow, that early? Okay.
52, 54.
Okay, there we go. I'm wondering to what degree just Japanese culture was shaped by Astro Boy because it was so popular and it became such a part of their culture. And also to what degree Japanese culture allows for that, because you got to remember that Japanese culture, people have very specific roles in Japanese culture.
Right.
In fact, one could argue that Japanese see human beings as components of society. They don't think society is made of human beings. They think human beings are part of society. It's almost that reverse thing where they almost see people as robots in some ways. Like we are part of a greater machine. We are machines. We're just part of something greater than us. And I think that allows for them to view Astro Boy and view robots like that with a much calmer heart. I guess that's not quite the right word. It allows them to be accepted much easier because Japanese have a different idea. We're all robots in a way. Whether we're made of machine or flesh and blood, doesn't really matter. We are all robots if we're working towards being part of society. Whereas the Americans are the exact opposite. To them, it's all about freedom and individuality, and society is just what individuals decide to make of it, and therefore the robot is a threat to that.
Yeah, it could be, and it's the idea too that Japan didn't really have the fear of technology that we did, and it might be because in Japan, when you get to like the 50s and modern industrialization really starts, they had the image of Astro Boy, and technology was seen as this thing that would help. It added to life. Whereas the image that we had for technology and coming industrialization in the future was the atom bomb.
Very true.
Like we even called it the atomic age. That's a mixed blessing at best, buddy.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, though, that, okay, you could actually argue, going back to one of our earlier episodes, you could actually make a very good argument that, the Germans and their amazing technology suddenly rose up and threatened to destroy America and threatened to conquer and take over everyone. And that's where they have this idea of technology as the enemy. Whereas to the Japanese, technology was a savior that let them quickly rise up and become equal to the European powers.
Right.
So the Japanese have not viewed technology through the same dark lens we have. They have viewed it through a dark lens at times, and they still do, but not in the same way.
Yeah, it's true, and I think, again, there's something to it. I think maybe going back to the Industrial Revolution, that when that first kicked in like Britain and that, there was a resistance to it, that people saw an immediate downside, that people would lose their livelihood because a machine could do their job.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if that has, because we've always in the West had this idea that technology bad, that even when we love it, there's always a downside.
Yeah. All tech comes with a downside.
And it's interesting that the closer the technology comes to human, the more we see that downside. Because again, if you go back to, say, the pulp era, the mechanical man was always the providence of the mad scientist.
True.
It was never the good guy hero scientist that built artificial like men or artificial life forms. That was the villain's thing.
Well, because it was a way to come up with a cool, villain henchman, basically.
Yeah, it wasn't. I think, in some ways, it's that idea that of unnaturalness. Because we're hitting on the concept of the uncanny valley.
Yes, we better cover that. So the idea is basically of the uncanny valley, for those who aren't familiar, is that there's a certain point where something becomes almost human, but not quite, and that we naturally react against it. We have a psychological bad reaction to it, basically.
Yeah.
So you can become like 95% human and we're okay with you, but if you get to that's just to pick a number. But if you become like that, you cross that line to 96%, it's like, whoa, you're just fucked up. Like at that point, you're a human, but you're a fucked up human. Instead, whereas at 95%, you were a machine or something else. But there's that weird line that you cross, and that's the point where you become a messed up human instead of something else. And that's called the uncanny valley. This weird little zone that's in there. And then if you can get past that and get closer to human than that, there's a certain point where you actually become accepted again. It's like, oh, you're human, okay. Or at least you're something like a human and we can kind of accept you. But there's this weird little dip, that's what they call the uncanny valley, where we just can't accept you.
Yeah, the irony, it was a professor, was it the Tokyo University of Technology that came up with the concept, as I recall.
Right.
And it's one of the hypotheses that they had for why this happens.
Right.
Is if you get something that's really close to human, but not quite there, we kind of associate it with like a dead body.
Yeah, that would make the most sense. Yeah.
So that's why if you get an android it's kind of human, but it's kind of mannequin-like, but it moves like a human, and when you shake its hand, it's cold to the touch.
Yep.
It sort of reminds us of a dead guy, and it shouldn't be moving, and part of us just gets creeped out instinctively by that.
Yep.
But
it's either that, or one time there were creatures that weren't human but were almost human sharing the planet with us, and we eventually managed to wipe them out, or did we? And it's an instinctive racial memory that tells us to beware of them.
Oh, the Nephilim.
There we go. Yeah.
That's right. Because when the aliens that we thought were angels came to Earth and reproduced with human females, they created the Nephilim, the giants that, in theory, Goliath was a remnant of. And then we went to war and chased them all out because it was aliens.
Right, yeah. Because it's always aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Dang aliens.
But even that idea, if you want to take it the other way around, when you look at
Actually, hold on. Let's stop for a second before you go. Keep in mind that we know that at one point we're Homo sapiens, right? We know at one point there were other human races on the planet. Prior to about 13,000 years ago, there might have been quite a few of them. In fact, that's when basically most of humanity almost got wiped out by a comet strike or something to that effect, and the climate plunged and all this stuff. You can read about that. But the point is that we know at one point there were other kinds of humans. So what if that really is a reaction to the other kinds of humans that there once were? You're not of my tribe. You're one of these other types, and therefore we're reacting badly to them.
It could be. The fly in the ointment of that plan, that idea is what we would recognize as a modern man. Mm-hmm. Like, say, a Cro-Magnon and after, they lived with Neanderthal.
Yeah.
Who were really, really close, but a little bit different. And the current theory is that the Neanderthal were actually smarter and stronger than the Cro-Magnons, and that they interbred, and that's where the Neanderthal went. They got, like, bred into the general population.
Yeah, makes sense.
Which in a weird way does kind of sound like that story of like the Nephilim.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's possible. And it's even possible to the point too that if you go that far back that just another tribe of like Homo sapiens might seem like aliens to us because they do their hair different or that.
I think you would have to go a little farther than that for them to be Uncanny Valley, but yeah, okay.
Well, in theory,
maybe there were like monkey men at one point, or what we would call monkey men, but that was probably Neanderthals. But the point is that that they looked very different than Homo sapiens as we're used to them.
Yeah, it could. I don't know if it necessarily have to be a different species because we don't always do so good with the same species nowadays. It just kind of looks a little different from us. So
very true, very very true.
So it's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we're a natural bunch of racists, basically.
Yeah, because it's we don't react well to different, which is the whole thing of the Uncanny Valley. Except, like you were saying, if you can get enough similarities back up, then we accept you as like human again.
Yep. And it doesn't matter how strange you are, there's some guy out there that's willing to do you.
Rule 34!
So, yeah, well, no, I don't... Is that Rule 34? It's something close anyway. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about sex robots. But before we do, we should probably talk about, you were saying, coming at that from the reverse angle. And then I interrupted you rudely. Sorry.
Where was I going with that?
Sorry, I screwed that up. We were just talking about, of course, like the idea of the Nephilim, and then... And then you were going to say, and taking it from the reverse angle, and then I suddenly said, well, wait a moment, let's talk about the fact that there were other humans at one point. And maybe that's where it came from. But okay, whatever. Okay, let's talk about sex robots then. All right, so yeah, I mean, there are actual, what are effectively sex robot clubs right now, except they're just sex dolls that maybe have a few, extra emotion built into them. They're animatronic sex dolls, basically. But they actually exist. They've actually started creating, like, robot brothels, basically. And they're not really robots. They're just like dolls still at this point, but whatever. The point is that we're working towards that. So what do you think is that fascination then? If we have the uncanny valley thing, but at the same time, we still want to have sex with them.
See, there's a couple, because technically, we've had sex robots for the last like 4,000 years, because in a very basic sense, that's what a dildo is.
That's true, although it's not, no, a dildo is a tool. That would be like calling a fork or something like that a robot. It's not. I mean, or a pencil is not a robot. A dildo is simply a tool that we use for certain things.
Said tool.
Exactly. I mean, we're not talking about the evil Nazi F machine here. We're talking about the wandering kid joke. We're talking about, that's just a tool that's still used by human hands. If for it to be counted as a robot, it would have to be, mounted on like something that looked like Bender from Futurama, I suppose.
That's a disturbing thought, and I'm sure Rule 34 somewhere we could look that up, but let's not.
I guarantee you there's tons of Bender porn. I imagine there's tons and tons and tons of it, and I've never seen any of it, nor do I want to, but I'm sure it's there because Rule 34. But no, so I disagree. That would not count as a sex robot, not unless it had like a whole mechanical arm backing it and was like, anyway, whatever. I'm not going to get into the details. The point is that, no, I mean, we, for some reason, have this fascination. You want to talk about, there are children, and we apparently want to make children with robots too.
See, now this is where I think the dildo example is important.
Okay.
And poor old Jack is missing this part of the conversation.
Yeah, poor guy.
Because, and this is where I think the idea of robot and human really gets scary for people, because when you talk about sex and sexuality, you're discussing a lot of things, because there's a physical sensation, there's an emotional aspect, there's the emotional aspect, I guess you'd say there's two, because there's the emotional sharing, and there's the emotional what you keep to yourself parts of it.
That's true.
And this is where the idea of an actual sex robot as opposed to a mechanical sexual device or implement, you start getting all these lines blurred, and it starts hitting at some of those fundamental human things. And we've talked about this before, especially in North America, people are terrified of sex. As a culture, we don't know what to do with it. And I think because, in some part, it causes us to do all kinds of stupid shit, especially when you're like a teenager. We don't entirely understand it. We never fully master it. It creates like very strong drives. There's a lot of autonomic responses. And that's why mixing this with the idea of like artificial life or artificial beings gets scary, because it's a process we're not comfortable or understand to begin with.
True.
And that's where you get the idea of a robot. If it's just a mechanical device that's simulating things, well, there's the idea of sensation. That is the physical part.
Which is something those dolls can do, definitely.
Yeah, but you also get to the idea that you get to the internal emotional parts.
Yeah.
And the external. And I can't think of the technical term, but it's the idea that there's stuff, when you're in any kind of like relationship, there's stuff that I feel by myself, and then there's stuff that I feel with my partner.
True.
And this is where the idea that there's a lot of people for whom even sex with another person, it's not an exchange. It would be for entirely personal gratification, and that's the physical, and there's a certain sense of emotional. Like we all know, like douche bros and stuff, that it's all about the conquest. As a friend of ours once said, for a lot of people, sex is just masturbation you can brag about. But that's internal. Then there's the external, that you form a physical connection with a person. It creates all kinds of chemical effects in the brain. It's that closeness. It's that vulnerability of somebody like seeing you like in all your nakedness and not hiding nothing. It's it's the performance, it's the gratification of the other. There's that emotional, that external, that emotional connection, and it gets to that problem of, can a mechanical being do all of that?
Right.
And you see it in weird parts, because I know they make, like, say, super realistic sex dolls that people, a lot of times, like, mostly dudes, will form, like, this weird kind of emotional connection with.
Right.
And I think because what you're getting is, you're getting that internal emotional thing is starting to spill over.
Right.
And they're reading into it that idea that there is this connection, and they're reading that into the circumstances that might not be there.
Yes. That's why you have to shoot it in the face and prove to them that they're robots, and then they'll leave. Then they'll finally go.
And it leads to that thing is this problematic enough to be a disorder? And if so, or if not, if you get a machine that can kind of replicate a reaction, is that going to make it worse? And is there unhealthy versions? Because I was reading an article, it might have been Mysterious Universe that put it up, that they're working on like sex robots that you can simulate a personality with.
Well, technically, they already have simulated personalities in Japan. I'm not referring
Surprise!
Sorry. What I'm referring to is there are these little holographic wife things that you can get that are basically kind of like pseudo AIs that basically, when you come home, they ask you how your day was and everything like that. And they're these little anime girls that exist in holographic tanks. And they learn about your habits, and they ask you about things. And they're still just little smart little machines. They're not really actual intelligent, but they're already doing their best to create like simulated partners.
Well, even like a dating game, like the dating video games is kind of that as well, that it's a weird mechanical blurring of that internal external thing.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And that's what they have, though. I mean, and then so think about this. You have a dating sim where you can kind of have a whole simulated relationship with a person. Then you have a simulated, cartoon version of it that you can talk to as you're sitting in your apartment eating your breakfast each morning and everything like that. And then you sleep with a giant body-sized pillow, with a picture of that person on the pillow, as though you're actually sleeping with another quasi-human being. And everything I've just described is something real Japanese people, men and women, mostly men, but men and women, are doing right now as we're recording this.
Yeah. Because, there's a little more to it than just that. 2 points. One to clear up, I think one of the reasons why you typically see, like, the sex robot kind of thing aimed at men.
Because we screw everything?
Kinda. In general, the male brain responds to components.
Yes, that's true.
And that's one of the reasons why dudes will respond to, say, images more than females will. Whereas females respond to context. Like the female brain responds more if it's got like a whole situation to put together and draw from. Whereas guys will respond more to components. And that's one of the reasons why they say on average, as an aggregate, females engage in more and more varied social interaction than dudes do. And dudes tend to gravitate towards, say, more mechanical things like building cars and playing electric guitars, because that's components, that you're dealing with components and then working from. And it's one of the reasons why you can aim, like, say, a sex doll at a dude, because a dude is looking for image. Like,
all we care about is, does it look hot and does it feel good? Okay.
Yeah. And on average more. Now, females will do the same thing, hence my dildo reference. But it tends to be, at least society kind of latched onto that, because I think it's the easy answer, and aims more of that sort of thing at guys. There was a study, as a weird aside, that Jeff found, that I believe was by the University of that when confronted by breasts, even images of breasts, the higher functions of a guy's brain start to shut down.
Right.
And like, because they would give you complicated math things to do, and they'd time how long it took for you to solve these complicated problems. Then they'd show you like bikini models and make you do more. And as they did this, they found the dude's reactions and ability to do math was deteriorating.
Right.
And again, it's just because the male brain tends to respond to components, and that's why it responds to image. And one of the things that you start running into, and this is, if you ever read stories about, say, female characters that develop weird relationships with like sex bots and that, it usually starts going a little more this way, that if we can create a relationship android that's sufficiently complex and reactive enough to pass a Turing test, and again, Jack mentioned it, the Turing test was a proposed method of determining if you have artificial intelligence or not. That was basically a person would be in a room and they'd be having a conversation with someone they couldn't see. And that someone would say be a machine. And if it could fool that person into thinking they were talking to another human, then you've got some form of artificial intelligence.
Right.
If you had an android partner that could do that, are you now actually having a relationship?
One could argue no, because it can't reciprocate the feelings, not really. It's simulating them.
Right. But then you could also put forth the argument that, what are our feelings?
That's a very complex thing.
And that's
a complex answer.
And that's usually why if it's a female-oriented story, you'd see stuff like that, because the context thing, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Whereas, again, dudes are... Yeah. Anyway.
They can't... Well, that's the conventional thinking, because, again, going back to the Twilight Zone episode Jack mentioned, that's the problem. It's the dude has... or thinks he has this relationship with this android, this artificial woman.
Right.
And it's that question, did he really? Was it just desperation because there was nothing else to interact with? And that's one of the questions I think you have to kind of to deal with. Because at some point you will develop a machine complicated enough that its responses will be indistinguishable from a normal person's responses.
Yeah, definitely. And at that point, what do we do?
Right.
Like, how do we interact with it? What do we do with it? And also, does that change what we are as human beings? Does it change our understanding what it is to be human?
And at what point does this sort of thing become problematic? Because going back to that idea of the sex robots that had variable personalities you could set, one of the things the article talked about was you could make one that was really not interested in a physical relationship at the time and simulate forcing yourself on it.
Yeah.
That presents a lot of problems because, again, what does that say about you? Is this some disturbing dark corner of your brain that you shouldn't give like voice to?
Yeah.
Is it harmless fun like in a video game when you shoot all kinds of like NPCs? When you get to that point where you've got an android that is enough that it's simulating a true human response, at what point does this get really disturbing and say like litigationable? And this will be an issue that will come up at some point. Well,
the thing is, though, a human partner would be traumatized, perhaps, by, let's be blunt, by sexual assault.
Right.
Whereas the android presumably would not, because it has no feelings to begin with. So it has to... There's no trauma to be had, basically. It really is just a simulation. So in that sense, it doesn't have any negative repercussions from whatever you do to it.
But the problem is, what if we get to this point, and this again goes with a lot of what we've talked about in general that makes the idea of robots scary. What if you've got one that's a learning system? And it does remember, and it does alter behavior.
Based on that, yeah.
Based on that. Now it gets super because you can always make the argument, well, I ultimately programmed it for this, and I can turn it off and reprogram it, but we're at a point now where you can kind of do that to a human being. Like, I can use drugs to edit your behavior and edit your memory.
To a degree, but it's still limited, and as they've been discovering, it doesn't completely remove it and doesn't completely edit it out. I mean, we're still not
for
there
now
yet.
And that's the problem, because these things are going to develop in parallel, and I think this is where the fear comes from, that as we make machines that are more human and individualistic, we may discover that we ourselves are more mechanical than we'd like to admit.
Yeah, that's very true.
And then what the hell do you do with that? And then if you want to go kind of an even weirder, more disturbing place, and I'm going to say this because I just rewatched the original 80 Police. What happens when you get to the point that you do have a robotic system that's some kind of, say, learning machine, and they do start to develop sentience, and they do start to develop, say, drives and concepts of their own, and we're using them as sex robots and making them do all the laundry? Like, what happens then? And when they inevitably rebel against us, are they still the villains at that point?
True. That's a very good question. I have no answer for that. I mean, we've created a slave race at that point.
Because there's a thing that's come up twice in science fiction that is horrifying, but played off as a joke each time. Do you remember Red Dwarf?
Yes, of course.
That technology was so advanced that the hero, well, the main character, won't call him a hero, had an artificially intelligent toaster.
Right. And
do you remember he didn't like toast? Would you like some toast? No, not right now. Well, what's the point of having an intelligent toaster if you don't like toast? And this thing is having a mental breakdown in the background all through season 1. Well, the problem is this thing is having a breakdown. It's aware, it's self-aware, and it has no purpose. Essentially, its God has literally turned its back on it. And then that idea comes up again in Rick and Morty.
Okay.
Where Rick invents a self-aware robot because he doesn't want to reach for the butter.
Right.
Master, what is my purpose? To get butter. Oh. And it's a horrifying thought. And it ties in with when they did the D20 Gamma World. One of the things that they said led to the end of the world in one of the established scenarios was that technology was so advanced that we could create true artificial intelligence cheaply and easily. And we did, and we put it everywhere, and it got bored. And that's what wiped out the world, that the computer started messing with the stock market just to see what would happen.
Right.
There's one of the examples they give is it's a groundskeeper. It's an artificial intelligence that works at, I think it was like a factory. Like just keeping the grounds like neat and orderly. And this thing was going nuts because it had an IQ of like 400 and we were making it mow the lawn and that was it. And when the war starts, it used the herbicide to put a universal machine code targeting symbol on the lawn of the buildings. It's like, just end it all. I don't want to do this anymore.
Right. Wow. Well, yeah, that's oddly reasonable. I mean, yeah, if you have these sentient slaves that are super bored or frustrated with their existence, they're going to do some horrible stuff. Or maybe they'll all just end up on the scrap heap like an AI.
which again was what makes that one of the depressing movies, because you do create something that has feelings and then when we get bored of it, we throw it away.
Yeah. I was going to say, you described Toy Story as well, but anyway.
Well, and again, that's true, and that's one of the scary things about Toy Story. These things are immortal?
That's true.
Oh, sweet merciful fates, what's happening when we throw them out? Toy Story 4 is going to be a horror story.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know. What will we do once they are sentient? And will we even realize it? It may actually be quite a while before we realize that we've actually created sentient life forms, but we don't know that, and so we treat them like complete crap.
Yeah, because remember, even nowadays, us human beings don't recognize other human beings as sentient life forms.
I'd like to think we usually do.
Well, on the surface, but when you get right down to it, like, especially if you follow, like, say, politics or entertainment, look at how many times we think a dissenting opinion is the sheeple just doing what they're told, man. Well, we're not seeing them as a sentient being. We're seeing them as the result of circumstance.
Yeah, but that's like a side effect of the whole monkey sphere thing. I mean,
It isn't.
Sorry.
How much easier will that be with an artificial, like, creation?
That's very true.
Like,
Very,
those
very
bad
true.
instincts are going to come back. And that's why I say when the robot rebellion happens, we may not be on the righteous side.
Well, it all comes back to what you once told me, actually, back in our university days, long, long ago. You said maybe our very reason for existence on this planet is to create the next dominant life form, and then, relatively speaking, and then just move right along.
Mm.
Maybe we are destined to just create these AIs or robots and such, and then we will just die out and they'll replace us, and that's just our reason for our existence.
Could be. And then that's why we have that drive to do so. It's all nature's way of clearing the palate for the next attempt.
Maybe. Well, whatever that next attempt is. That's an interesting question. Actually, let's talk about that then. Why do you think we do have what seems to be almost a drive to create these things that could very well replace us and destroy us?
I think there's probably a bunch of different reasons that different people get to different degrees.
Mm.
Like, I think part of it is that need to go on, to propagate one way or another. Like, I think the average person has kids. Either the creative or intelligent person creates things. Like, you do art because art will outlast you. You build buildings because the building will outlast you. It shows that you were here, but it moves everything along at the same time. I think a lot of people, like, artificial life and mechanicals and that, are seen as a way of getting out of chores.
Right.
Like, that was back in the day. The utopia was that we would have machines that did everything and no one would have to work. And then when that happened, we're like, but wait, we still need money, so we're all fucked now.
Right.
But I think, yeah, there's that idea that we want slaves. You know, we want somebody or something that we can make do all the shit we don't want to do.
Yeah, basically. And then eventually we don't do anything, at which point we kind of cease to exist.
Which is kind of weird, because in a metaphysical way, I wonder if that's why the age of miracles, as it were, seems to have passed us by.
What do you mean?
That if the god or the gods created us as their implements, and then they stopped doing stuff, that, yeah, they cease to exist. And now we exist. And then because we're made in their image, we'll do the same thing. We'll make something to free us from our toils or to serve us. Right. And then we'll stop doing, and then we'll cease to exist. And then they'll do the same thing because we made them in our image.
There was actually an anime, like it was on a year or so back, and I wish I could remember the name of it because I only saw like a bit of one. But basically, it's almost this odd slice of life. It's not, and what it's about is it's about a future where the world is here, basically, there's been an apocalypse for whatever reason, but the world is actually not that bad. It just means humanity's gone, and it's about this little girl robot who's basically on a quest to find a human. Yeah, she's looking for a human just to see what one is like, basically, or something to that effect. And she's traveling around and encountering all these different places where all these different robots are living their own existences and such in these tiny little villages. It's very rural. It's very pastoral. But but there are no humans in it. Well, presumably, they're all robots, and so she's encountering robots in all these different situations and settings, not in an urban setting, but in a pastoral rural setting.
Mm-hmm.
And she's traveling around in like this post-apocalyptic Japan looking for a human. And I wish I could remember what it was called, but anyway, I'll put it in the show notes.
Okay.
And so, maybe one day we'll be the mythical beings.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe robots will have churches worshiping us.
Or their idea of there's a story. There's another. Is that how? Oh, what was it? There's another one of those old stories I've been looking for.
Mm-hmm.
That was. It's called City, but I can't remember who wrote it. That was the premise. It was this robot servant that outlived humanity. And then 1,000 years in the future, I think it was dogs had evolved to sentience.
Right.
And this thing was taking what it remembered of humanity and trying to rebuild the world with these sentient dogs. And it remembered this weird idealized version of humanity that it was trying to pass on to them.
Right.
Oh, but I can't remember who wrote it.
That's okay. Okay. Well, if anyone knows who wrote that, please write in.
Mm-hmm.
Please write in and let us know.
Because it hits at that idea, and then again in a weird kind of way, that sort of hits back at that idea of the ancient astronaut types.
Mm-hmm.
That in a way, that's what they think we are. That the ancient beings created us, and then for whatever reason moved on, and now we're living kind of a weird, sort of hybridized, idealized, mythologized version of what it was like when they were here.
So I guess in the end, really, in this incredibly existential and depressing episode, I think we should probably leave it on that note, because I don't think we're going to get any more upbeat.
There's
okay.
one.
Okay, go. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, short of actually saying that there are versions of the future. If I recall right, I think it's the Culture series, which I believe is by Ian M. Banks, is set in a world where basically robots and humans, well, AIs and humans, coexist in almost perfect harmony, and have actually created this future utopian paradise for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it is actually possible that we may be, taking the North American doomsayer approach, but in actual reality, robots and humans in the future may coexist. Maybe Astro Boy really is the future.
It could be. There's another one that might be more likely.
Okay.
Because there's a weird aspect of the idea of robot that we've kind of danced around, we didn't get to, and there's a weird backwards example of.
Okay, please, go.
Because we didn't talk about the concept of a soul.
Okay.
We
didn't quite describe that. Okay, go.
And it's the idea, because that's ultimately what a lot of these stories say separates us from the machine, that we have like an eternal soul, that there's a spark of our essence that carries on.
Right.
And the argument could be made that that's also what a program is. That maybe a machine, because you can download its consciousness, that's what a soul is. And it gets blurred because you'll find stories where we get to the point where we can download your consciousness into a machine.
Well, that goes back into the old idea, is that just simply a copy of my consciousness, or is that my actual consciousness?
Right. And then that's that idea, if that machine looks like me and acts like me and thinks it's me, is it really me? Or is there this other part that it's lost, that my humanness, my soul, is this intangible, impermeable thing that we can never simulate.
Huh.
And there's a weird example of that, because one of the things that people have talked about fairly recently,
right,
is the idea of droids in Star Wars.
Interesting. Okay, go.
Because the concept is, droids in Star Wars are obviously self-aware.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
The higher ones, when you get to like the type 3s, the type 4s, they're aware of, they're knowledgeable. They have emotion. Like 3PO is a total wimp. He has feelings. And people have said, and then it's horrifying that they're just treating them as like inanimate objects and such.
Right. Okay.
And there's two arguments as to why that is. One argument is that if you go to, say, the prequels, when you had like the droid army, that people still feel kind of a resentment towards them because of that war. But there's another weird thing that you can put forth the argument, and this is where the soul comes in, that Star Wars, the dominant religion, at least in a lot of the Star Wars settings, is the Force. That it's the energy that binds all things. We find out it's a virus, but whatever.
Maybe. Yeah.
But it's presented as this thing that joins all life, and droids cannot use the Force.
Right. They have no connection to the Force, so therefore they have no souls.
Yeah, and then that's kind of weirdly implied without being stated, and then that's one of the few stories I've seen in recent times that really gets into that theological, metaphysical thing, which I think takes us right back to that idea that we started with, that you could look at a lot of the creation stories that we are automata for some other race.
Okay, then.
So, will our robots come up with their own version of the idea of the soul, that they will see themselves as such individuals, that there's some kind of intangible essence to them that doesn't carry on? And will that be the case, or will that be their hubris, just as that may indeed be our hubris?
I have no clue, man. That's gone outside of my realm of comprehension, especially at this time of night. Wow. Okay. I think we're going to end there on that note. So do robots have souls? Okay.
What if R2-D2 really spelled God?
Thanks for listening, everyone. We really appreciate you sitting through this whole discussion of robots and souls and sex and everything that we've managed to get to. We didn't really actually end up talking that much about robots in popular culture, but whatever.
We talked about the concept of robots.
We talked about the concept of robots, but we just never got around to the actual popular culture stuff. Not too much. Like, we touched on it. Some touchstones, but not in any deeper way. But then again, it's kind of hard to trace the origins of robots in popular culture, so I guess we can't really be blamed. I mean, it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, and like modern times, it comes down to two things. They either destroy us or find out what love is. There you go.
Yep, pretty much it. Yep. Or on a quest to find out what love is, such as Astro Boy, for example. So if you have any particular thoughts about this episode or this topic, please feel free to drop by obeythedna.com and leave us a message, leave us a note. If you can remember any of the things we forgot or didn't know the names of, please also drop by and let us know how you feel about the show. We always welcome feedback, and we always want to hear from our listeners, because we are human, we swear.
Hey, this will be coming out just after the point that like weed is legal. I wonder if that's going to affect our ratings.
No, man. I don't think it's going to affect them at all. But you never know. Maybe. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, man. Anyway, good night, folks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!